In the northeast of Glasgow, there once stood a house that told you everything. Two ordinary council houses knocked into one in a poor corner of Britain. The man who lived there had named it the Ponderosa after a ranch in an American western. Some said he pulled in £100,000 a week, and across 30 years, through 2 killings done almost in the open, the police could never make a single charge stick, because nobody in that district would ever stand up in court and say what they had seen. They called him the Godfather, and for the better part of a century, in the pubs and the schemes of this city, a hidden kind of power really did rule whole neighbourhoods, while the law could almost never prove any of it. But to understand how a housing scheme on the edge of Glasgow came to be ruled by a man who modelled himself on a Hollywood mob boss, you have to go back much further than him, to a time when Glasgow did not build ranches. It built the engines that ran the world. In its pomp, Glasgow called itself the second city of the empire after London. This was not modesty. On the River Clyde, 1 in every 5 ships afloat anywhere on earth had been built here, and a few miles north of the shipyards in a district called Springburn, the city built something even more improbable. Springburn built locomotives, not a handful, thousands of them for the entire planet. When 3 of the great Glasgow engine makers merged in 1903 to form the North British Locomotive Company, they created the largest locomotive builder in Europe and the British Empire, second on earth only to the giant Baldwin Works in the United States. At its height, it employed around 8,000 men and could turn out close to 600 engines a year. Picture what that meant on the street. The finished locomotives were too heavy for ordinary rails, so each was lifted by crane, laid on a special wagon, and hauled slowly through the tenement streets to the quayside at Finnieston, where they were swung out over the water by one of the largest cranes in the country and lowered into the holds of ships bound for India, for South Africa, for South America. Children stood on the pavements and watched engines the size of houses roll past their front doors, bound for countries they would never see. Pipes and piers, cranes and bridges, boilers and steam hammers, all of it left this one city and fanned out across the globe. Springburn was so proud of itself that people called it the Rome of the North. It had its own grand public hall, its own churches, its own shopping streets thick with money, and a workforce that believed the engines would roll out forever. As late as the mid-1930s, one of the senior men at the company stood up and declared that electricity would never replace steam on the mainline railways. Remember that sentence. It is close to the most expensive mistake in the history of the district, and it is coming back. Here is the paradox that sits underneath everything that follows. The very thing that made Glasgow rich was also the thing that made it dangerous. The work drew hundreds of thousands into the city, from the Highlands, from Ireland, from across Europe, faster than anyone could build homes to hold them. They were packed into tenements, families of 8 and 10 crammed into a single room, sharing one outside toilet with a dozen other families, in districts like the Gorbals and the Garngad and Bridgeton, that became some of the most overcrowded slums anywhere in Britain. The richest workshop on earth, and the very worst housing on earth printed side by side on the same map. The wealth flowed outward to the empire. The people were left behind in the dark. And out of that dark, Glasgow grew something the newspapers of the day gave a very deliberate name. They called it the Scottish Chicago. The razor gangs of the 1920s and 30s are still the thing this city is most notorious for, and the name tells you the weapon. An open razor, cheap, legal to carry, easy to hide in a lapel, and capable of laying a man's face open from ear to mouth in one motion. The wounds were so common they earned their own grim nickname, the Glasgow Smile. In 1935, a novel called No Mean City turned these streets into legend, telling the story of a Gorbal slasher, and it sold and sold, fixing the image of a violent Glasgow in the public mind for generations, whether the city liked it or not. The most famous of all the gangs came out of Bridgeton in the East End. They were the Billy Boys, founded around 1924 by a young man named Billy Fullerton, and named not after him, but after King William of Orange, King Billy, the hero of Protestant loyalism, because these were not only fighting gangs. Glasgow's divisions ran down the oldest fault line in the city, between Protestant and Catholic, native Scot and Irish immigrant, and the Billy Boys fought a long war with Catholic gangs like the Norman Conks, marching through one another's territory on religious holidays with the deliberate aim of starting a riot. The Billy Boys met at Bridgeton Cross. The Conks gathered barely half a mile away. That short distance was enough to keep the whole East End at war for a decade. The hatred was total and sometimes almost absurd in its commitment. On one occasion, the Billy Boys marched into Conk territory and were set upon so savagely that nearly every man was hurt. The only one to escape without a scratch, so the story goes, was the drummer who had climbed inside his own big drum and hidden there until it was over. It would be funny if the razors had not been real and the faces they opened had stayed open for life. For a long time, people liked to believe these had been honourable gangs that left ordinary folk alone. The historian Andrew Davies, who spent 15 years in the archives, showed this was a comforting myth. The gangs ran protection rackets modelled on the American underworld they had watched at the pictures, leaning on shopkeepers and publicans and bookmakers, demanding money to keep windows unbroken and premises unburned. They forced neighbours to pay towards their court fines. They used the razor and the threat of it to make certain no witness ever made it as far as the dock. Davies found men remembered by titles borrowed wholesale from the movies, a slasher known as the Razor King, and Fullerton himself described in his own time as the Al Capone of the East End. Glasgow had watched the American gangster on the screen, then quietly become him. It helped that the whole city was tipping into ruin around them. Between the winter of 1930 and the spring of 1935, unemployment across Glasgow ran between a quarter and a third of the workforce. Men who might once have worked in a shipyard or an engine shed now stood idle on the street corner, and the gangs, once the preserve of teenagers, filled up with grown men who had nothing else. Fullerton himself was no misunderstood folk hero. He had been a member of the British fascists, had been handed a medal for breaking the general strike of 1926, and would go on to raise a Glasgow branch of Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts. The man the East End feared was, underneath all the swagger, a thug looking for somebody to march behind. By the early 1930s, the violence had become a genuine emergency, and the city reached out for a genuine hard man to stop it. His name was Percy Sillitoe, and Glasgow brought him in as Chief Constable in 1931, on the strength of a reputation for smashing gangs down in Sheffield. He arrived to find a police force full of ageing, out-of-shape men, and rebuilt it from the ground up, recruiting the biggest, strongest officers he could find, many from the Highlands and Islands, and having a boxing champion train them to fight. His message to the gangs was blunt, and it became famous. The biggest gang in this town, he told them, is the Glasgow Police. He set up what was in effect the first modern flying squad in Britain, plainclothes officers in fast radio cars, ready to descend on a gang fight within minutes. And here the American myth folds back on itself. The press did not name that squad after anything Scottish. They called them the Untouchables, after Eliot Ness and the men who had just brought down Al Capone in the real Chicago. Sillitoe gave his police the checkered black and white band that still rings the caps of officers across much of the world, a pattern known ever since as the Sillitoe tartan. He earned a nickname too, the Hammer of the Gangs. His men ambushed the gangs, outfought them and jailed their leaders one by one. But the most revealing thing Percy Sillitoe did had nothing to do with the Razor gangs at all. He turned over the rocks inside the official city itself, and underneath found corruption reaching up into the council chambers, and saw 5 of Glasgow's own magistrates sent to prison, If you want to know who was really running parts of this city from the shadows, that is a truer answer than any street gangster. Some of it was wearing an official chain of office. Fullerton himself was picked off almost casually. Fond of his image as a family man, he was reportedly caught parading through the streets at the head of dozens of followers while cradling a baby, and Sillitoe simply had him arrested for being drunk in charge of a child. He was jailed, and the police drained £600 out of his bank account, cutting the financial legs from under the Billy boys. Then the war came, the young men went off to fight, and by the end of the 1930s the razor gangs had faded away. The Blades did try to come back. When the slashing crept up again in the early 1950s, a Glasgow judge named Lord Carmont began handing down sentences so heavy they entered the city's language. In one series of sittings, he jailed a handful of knife men for a combined total of more than 50 years, and for a whole generation afterward, to be given a savage sentence in a Glasgow court was simply to have been given a Carmont. It worked for a while. It always took a hard man on the right side of the law, a Sillitoe or a Carmont, to hold the line, and the moment the pressure eased, the violence came straight back. The city was never curing the disease, only suppressing the symptoms until they broke out somewhere new. Glasgow told itself it had won. It was wrong, and the reason is the real story here. The gangs did not come back because the police had gone soft. They came back bigger, richer, and far better organised, because of something Glasgow did to itself, with the very best of intentions. The intentions were good. Everyone agreed the slums were a disgrace, and after the war the city set out to clear them for good. The plan, laid out in a famous report by the corporation's own chief engineer, was to empty the packed old centre and move the people out. And it worked, in the narrow sense that hundreds of thousands were lifted out of single rooms without toilets and given homes with bathrooms and hot running water for the first time in their lives. But look closely at how it was done, because the cruelty is in the detail. Glasgow's council housing was sorted into a rigid ladder of 3 grades. At the top, ordinary schemes for the respectable. In the middle, intermediate schemes for the skilled worker. And at the very bottom, the grade they openly called rehousing or slum clearance for the poorest of the poor. Any tenant could tell at a glance which grade a scheme belonged to and where its people sat in the city's estimation of them. The clearest example was a scheme in the northeast called Black Hill. It was built on a former golf course wedged against a gasworks and a chemical plant, cut off from the rest of the city by railways and roads. It was built to the lowest grade, at around £250 a house, when a better grade of council home cost 4 times that. Into it, the corporation moved the families it had cleared from the old slums, then left them there, stigmatised as slum people the moment they arrived, in a place with almost no shops, poor transport, and a name that already sounded like a black mark. They had cleared the slum, then rebuilt the exact same concentrated poverty 3 miles further out, and given it a worse address. And Black Hill was only the beginning. As the great clearances rolled on through the 50s and 60s, whole populations were scattered. Some went to new towns built from nothing in the countryside, like East Kilbride and Cumbernauld. Some were stacked into vast estates on the edge of the city, and some were sent straight up into the sky, into towers so tall they became famous in their own right, the Red Road flats chief among them, at one time some of the highest residential blocks in all of Europe. The planners looked at their drawings and saw a clean modern city rising out of the smoke. What they could not see, because it could not be drawn, was what happens to a close-knit community when you take it apart and post it in fragments to the 15th floor and the far horizon, and then the ground gave way beneath the whole of it. In the 1950s, Almost half the homes in Glasgow were still officially overcrowded, and as late as 1957, 97% of the housing in the Gorbals was still judged sanitarily unfit. Worse, the great industries that had justified the entire city were beginning to die. Remember that confident man back in the 1930s, the one who promised electricity would never replace steam? The rest of the world had not been listening. Railways everywhere were electrifying, and the Springburn works, whose entire genius lay in the steam locomotive, were too proud and too slow to follow. They gambled on the wrong technology, could not compete, and in 1962, the North British Locomotive Company collapsed into liquidation, throwing around 4,500 men out of work. The workshop of the world was closing. A single repair shop clung on for another generation, until it too shut in 1986, taking a further 1,600 jobs with it. The engines that had rolled through the streets to the ends of the earth would roll no more. So picture the families now out in the new schemes by the 1960s and 70s. The breadwinner's trade is vanishing, the work is gone, and he and his family are marooned on the far edge of town, or 15 floors up in a tower block in a city where hardly anyone owns a car, cut off from everyone they ever knew. The old tenements had at least been crowded with life. The new schemes were often just isolation with a better bathroom. There is one small haunting detail that captures it. When the old districts were demolished, the men moved miles away, kept travelling back to the one thing that survived, the corner pub, so that for years there were pubs standing alone in fields of rubble, still full every night of people who no longer lived anywhere near them. The city had built new slums to replace the old ones, and built them around the pub. In 1962, the same year the locomotive works died, Billy Fullerton died as well, in poverty in a single room near Bridgeton Cross, still only in his 50s, and was buried in an unmarked grave. Around 1,000 people are said to have marched behind his coffin. The man the East End had once feared ended with nothing, 2 endings inside a single year, and in that same northeast corner of the city, in exactly the kind of scheme the planners had just built, a very different kind of criminal was already coming up. Not a street brawler with a razor, a businessman. And here is the part that should stop you cold. This one man would dominate the entire Glasgow underworld for more than 30 years. The police would know his name, his address, and exactly what he did for a living. And across 3 decades, they would barely once make any of it stick. How a single man pulled that off, rising up out of a slum clearance scheme on the edge of a collapsing industrial city, is the strangest and the darkest part of this entire story. His name was Arthur Thompson, and it is almost too neat that he was born in Springburn itself, in 1931, the son of a steelworker in the heartland of the workshop of the world, at the exact moment that world was beginning to slide into decline. He was a product of the industrial city, and would become the master of the ruined one that replaced it. Thompson did not begin with sectarian marches or gang colours. He began with money. He started out as a moneylender and understood something the razor gangs never grasped, that fear is most profitable when it is quiet and regular. He lent to people the banks would never touch at rates they could never hope to clear, and for those who fell behind, he became notorious for a punishment so brutal it barely sounds real. He was said to crucify them, literally, hammering nails through a man's hands to pin him to a floor or a door, as a message to everybody else about what happened to people who did not pay Arthur Thompson on time. From the money lending came protection, and for a while bank robberies and armed heists. But the move that made him different, the move that made him the Godfather, rather than simply another hard man, was that he took the dirty money and washed it clean. He bought his way into legitimate businesses, into pubs and clubs and property, until on paper he was simply a wealthy Glasgow businessman, a familiar face at the football, a man who hosted events and shook hands with respectable people who half knew what he was and half chose not to know. He built his fortune inside the ordinary working life of the city, hidden in plain sight. One well-known Scottish sports broadcaster admitted years later that he had hosted events for Thompson and drunk in his pubs, which tells you how far the Godfather had reached into ordinary Glasgow life. The violence was almost the least of it. What truly gave him his lasting power was that so many respectable people found it easier to smile and look the other way. He reached far beyond Glasgow too. He built ties to the Krays twins in London, And the story that has always followed him is that Glasgow and London did each other's dirtiest work, arranging killings on one another's turf so that no local face was ever seen. There is a famous piece of folklore about a young Thompson walking into the Krays' own pub with a sawn-off shotgun to announce that he was not a man to be pushed around. It may be true, it may be legend, it may be exactly the kind of story a man like that is happy to let grow. And that is the point. Thompson understood that the myth was half the power. The myths piled up around him the way they do around any king. It was whispered that he had a hand in the planning of the Great Train Robbery, the most famous heist in British history, whose mail train had, after all, set off from Glasgow. He was said to be the safe pair of hands the London gangs trusted north of the border. Almost none of it was ever proven, and some of it was surely just talk. But a man in his position does not correct the talk. He lets it grow, because every fresh rumour is one more reason for a frightened man to pay up quietly and keep his mouth shut. His own family understood the cost of the name. To this day, some of his descendants are said to live under other identities, for their own safety. Nowhere was the myth more literal than at home. On a scrap of the Provan Mill scheme, he took 2 ordinary council houses and knocked them into a single fortified home, and named it the Ponderosa after the ranch in the American television western Bonanza. Sit with that image. A boy from the dying workshop of the world in a slum clearance scheme built for the poorest families in the city, building himself a cattle baron's ranch out of council housing and naming it after an American television show. Just as the Razor gangs had once copied Chicago, Thompson was now copying Hollywood. The Glasgow underworld kept dreaming in an accent it had learned at the pictures. By the 1990s, it was rumoured he was pulling in as much as £100,000 a week. Which brings us to the question this whole story has been circling. How does a man kill 2 people in broad daylight on a public road and then simply walk away a free man? Because that is exactly what Arthur Thompson did. In 1966, someone tried to murder him with a bomb wired to his car. It exploded but did not kill him. Instead, it killed his mother-in-law in the seat beside him. Within a short while, Thompson spotted 2 men he blamed for the bombing, members of a rival family called the Welshes, driving a van. He did not go to the police. He drove his own car straight at them, forcing the van off the road and into a lamppost, and both men died. Thompson was charged with their murder, and then the case simply dissolved, because the police could not find one single witness willing to go into a courtroom and testify against him. 2 men lay dead on a Glasgow street, and the entire district had gone deaf and blind overnight. This is the quieter truth beneath the dramatic title of Godfather. It was not the Mafia in the strict sense. There was no secret society bound by an oath, and no single man ever ran the whole of Glasgow the way a mayor runs a city. But in his own corner of it, Arthur Thompson did not need any of that. Fear did his governing for him. When a whole neighbourhood is too frightened to tell the police what it saw with its own eyes, that is its own kind of rule, more total than anything a badge could impose from outside. That is what people meant when they said the Godfather ran the city. They meant that the law stopped at the edge of his streets. The feud with the Welsh family did not end there. In 1969, Thompson's wife Rita forced her way into the Welsh home and stabbed the dead man's widow in the chest and went to prison for 3 years. And the attempts on Thompson's own life kept coming. In 1985, he was shot in the groin outside the Ponderosa. In 1988, he was run over by a car and shot at, again outside his own front door, and walked away with nothing worse than a broken leg. He seemed, to the whole city, genuinely untouchable, a man death itself kept missing. But the thing that finally destroyed Arthur Thompson was not a bullet or a bomb. It was the very business he had helped to build, coming home to him. Because in the 1980s, the Glasgow underworld found a new product, far more lucrative and far more corrosive than anything before it: heroin. And it poured into exactly the isolated, jobless schemes the city had built, into Black Hill and Provan Mill and all the rest, into communities already hollowed out by the death of industry. The Thompson family moved deep into the drug trade, and the man leading their expansion was Arthur's own eldest son, Arthur Jr., known across Glasgow by the cruel nickname Fat Boy. The empire that had embedded itself so cleverly inside the life of the working class was now poisoning that same working class on its own doorstep. In 1989, Thompson's daughter Margaret died of a drug overdose. The trade the family had fed on for years had begun to eat the family alive. Then it came for the heir. On the 18th of August 1991, Arthur Jr. was shot 3 times outside the Ponderosa and killed. A former enforcer for the Thompsons, a young man named Paul Ferris, was arrested and charged with the murder. And what followed was the darkest single day in this dark history. On the morning of Arthur Jr.'s funeral, 2 friends of Ferris, Bobby Glover and Joe Hanlon, both also suspected of involvement, were found shot dead in a car. The car had been left deliberately on the route of the funeral procession so that the hearse carrying Arthur Jr. would drive slowly past their bodies. There was even a bomb scare at the cemetery. It was a message written in corpses, and everybody in Glasgow understood at once exactly who it had come from. The trial of Paul Ferris became the longest and most expensive criminal trial in Scottish history up to that point, running 54 days at a cost of more than £4 million, with over 300 witnesses. And among those witnesses, giving evidence for the prosecution, was Arthur Thompson himself. Consider what that meant. The Godfather of Glasgow, the man whose entire empire had been built on the one iron law that nobody ever testifies, had walked willingly into a courtroom to testify. The code that had shielded him for 30 years, he was now trying to turn against another man. It did not work. Paul Ferris denied every charge, claimed the killing had been carried out by a hitman he knew only by a nickname, and the jury found him not guilty on every count. He walked out of that court a free man. For Arthur Thompson, that was the end. He had lost his daughter, then his son and heir, and now he had broken his own most sacred rule in open court and been defeated anyway. Less than 2 years later, on the 13th of March 1993, he died of a heart attack, aged just 61. There is a rumour, fitting for a man so wrapped in his own myth, that he did not die peacefully in his bed at all, and that his body was moved there afterwards so the story could be tidied up. He was buried in Ridley in the family plot, alongside the mother-in-law who had died in the car bomb meant for him, and the son gunned down at his own front gate. The dynasty that had ruled the schemes for a generation was, within a few years, finished. His surviving son Billy never took up the throne, struggled with addiction for the rest of his life, and died in 2017. So walk the ground itself today and see what a full century of all this actually left behind. The Ponderosa is gone. Black Hill's grim tenements were torn down, much of the scheme flattened to make way for a motorway, and new low homes built in their place. In the very act of demolishing it, the city was doing again exactly what it had done in the 1930s, clearing away the place it had built to solve the last problem in order to solve the new one. Springburn, where Thompson was born, where this whole story began, once the greatest concentration of locomotive building anywhere on Earth, has almost nothing left of it now. One of the last great works closed its doors as recently as 2019. The headquarters of the locomotive company, the building from which engines were once designed for half the world, is now a college, and Bridgeton Cross, where the Billy Boys once gathered to march, is just a junction now where the traffic passes, most of it never knowing what it is driving over. Here is the thing to hold on to at the end of all this. Glasgow was one of the most extraordinary builders the world has ever seen. It built ships and engines and bridges and cranes for an entire empire, things still out there carrying loads and spanning rivers on the far side of the planet today. But it could never build its way out of the gap between the wealth it created and the people it left standing in the rubble of that wealth. The razor gangs and the Godfather were not some foreign infection that had arrived from outside. They grew, precisely and almost inevitably, inside that gap. And every time the city tried to close it, with a crackdown, with a clearance, with a shiny new scheme, it only opened the gap somewhere else, and something worse grew up in the new opening. The razor was a copy of Chicago. The ranch was a copy of Hollywood. Both were dreams a poor city had borrowed to make some kind of sense of itself, and both ended in an unmarked grave and a family plot in Ridgely. And a few miles away, the great crane at Finiston, the one that once lowered finished locomotives into the holds of ships bound for the ends of the earth, still stands over the Clyde, floodlit at night now, pointing out over the empty water at an empire that is long gone, in a city that built the future for everyone but itself. If you found this one worth your time, YouTube reckons the video now showing on your screen is right up your street, so give it a click and let it play. And if you want more stories like this, the whole rise and fall of a single place, then subscribe and I will see you in the next one.